The studio lights were warm, the laughter was rolling, and Stephen Colbert was in his zone. The crowd at the Late Show was eating it up, every jab, every smirk, every pause for comedic timing. The night's guest was Representative Jasmine Crockett, and while most expected a blend of wit and political commentary, no one, not even Stephen, was ready for what was coming. He welcomed her to the stage with his signature mix of charm and satire. "You've been stirring things up on Capitol Hill," he grinned. "And that's coming from someone whose job is literally to stir." Laughter. Applause. Jasmine smiled politely as she took her seat, but her eyes held that familiar steel, the kind that says, "I'm not here to play cute." They bantered at first. Light questions. Who did her hair? What her Spotify playlist looked like. Then came the pivot. Colbert leaned in slightly, his tone playful but edged. "So, Representative, you've called out billionaires, challenged the Supreme Court, and taken on your own party more than once. What's it like waking up and choosing violence every morning?" The crowd chuckled. Jasmine didn't. She took a slow breath, adjusted her microphone, and said, "Stephen, I don't wake up and choose violence. I wake up and remember that silence is complicity, and I don't have that luxury." There it was. The laugh track didn't cue. The room shifted, like someone had opened a door to cold air. Stephen blinked, smiled awkwardly. "Well, that's one way to start the fire." Jasmine leaned forward, her voice level but cutting. "You joke, but there are families watching this show tonight who haven't had running water in 3 weeks. I'm not interested in being a meme. I'm here to speak for the people who'll never get a seat on this couch." That's when it began. Colbert, ever the master of tone control, tried to lighten things again. All right, you're clearly not here for the fluff. Let's talk real. Let's talk America." Jasmine nodded once. "Let's." The cameras were rolling. The air was dense. And for the first time in a long time, the Late Show felt less like entertainment, and more like reckoning. Stephen shuffled his blue cards. Not nervously, yet, but the energy had clearly shifted. The crowd, always quick to laugh, had gone unusually still. Even the band, cued to fill awkward silences with jazzy transitions, held off. "So," he began again, carefully, "you've made headlines for your, shall we say, passionate floor speeches." He lifted a brow. "Do you ever wonder if you're too fiery for Congress? Or are you exactly what it needs?" Jasmine didn't miss a beat. "You ask that like the two are separate things. Fire is what you need when the house is already burning." A few people in the audience exhaled, a sharp, collective damn. Colbert smiled again, but this time it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You say things like that and suddenly I feel like I should be the one taking notes." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. "Maybe you should." The crowd laughed, but differently now. Not at a joke, but at the truth she'd slid beneath it. Stephen straightened in his chair. "All right, let's get real," he said, flipping one of the cue cards over and ignoring it completely. "You've gone after everyone, Republicans, Democrats, lobbyists, CEOs. Do you ever feel like you're on an island?" Jasmine's face didn't change. "Only when people confuse comfort with correctness." The air thinned again. There was no dramatic music, no dimmed spotlight. Just Jasmine's voice cutting through a space where jokes usually lived. Stephen reached for a lifeline, his signature sarcasm. "Well, I'm starting to regret not drinking before this interview." A few chuckles. Not many. Jasmine smiled, but it wasn't friendly, it was precise. "You don't have to regret anything, Stephen," she said. "But I hope you understand that the people watching tonight, some of them haven't laughed in months. Some of them are on the edge, and not the funny kind. If we're going to pretend politics is just punchlines, we're going to lose more than elections. We're going to lose people." For a few seconds, the only sound was the low hum of studio lights. Colbert looked at her, really looked, and then said, almost under his breath, "You know, I didn't expect to feel small on my own stage." Jasmine didn't blink. Then maybe the stage is finally being used right. And with that, the real interview began. The control room upstairs had gone quiet. Producers leaned in. Editors stopped pre-cutting applause segments. Something was happening, and they knew it. Not a PR stunt. Not a viral bit. Something raw. Stephen cleared his throat. Let's talk systems. You've said, and I quote, America was not built to be equal. It was built to be managed. That's bold. Jasmine nodded. It's also true. And you think Congress is the solution to that? No. I think Congress is part of the problem. But that's why I'm there. The crowd stirred again. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was the storm. Stephen leaned forward. You're saying you walked into a burning house willingly? Jasmine turned slightly in her chair, fully facing him now. I walked into a house that burns the same people every generation, and I brought water. Not to save the building. To save the ones still inside. Silence. No punchline. No cue cards. Colbert exhaled. You know, this wasn't how I imagined tonight. I know, Jasmine said softly. Most people think I'll come on a show like this, laugh a little, dance around the issues. But I don't do costume politics. And I don't use makeup to cover bruises. I bring receipts. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded page, highlighted, annotated. She laid it on the desk between them. This is a federal report. Last year, 32 million Americans lived in housing insecurity. 32 million. But we spent 3 times that bailing out corporations who pay zero taxes. Stephen didn't touch the paper. Jasmine kept going. Your audience is mostly liberal, right? But they still laugh when I say, Section 8, like it's a punchline. They think poverty is either tragic or hilarious. Never urgent. That stung. And it was meant to. You want to know why I'm not afraid to be too much? Jasmine asked. Because someone has to be. Because subtle doesn't cut through generational silence. A young man in the front row sat with his hands clenched on his knees. A woman behind him wiped a tear from her cheek. They weren't watching TV anymore. They were watching someone fight for air inside a soundproofed building. Colbert swallowed. What would you say to people who think this is just performance? Jasmine's reply was immediate. Performers get paid to pretend. I don't pretend. I survive. And I speak, for people who aren't even allowed in the theater. Stephen lowered his eyes. He looked tired. Not insulted. Just, honest. He finally whispered, maybe the joke's on us. Jasmine stared back, her voice firm. It's always been. Backstage, the tension rippled beyond the velvet curtains. Staffers whispered. A producer reached for her earpiece, then stopped. There was nothing to fix. Nothing to soften. Jasmine wasn't derailing the show, she was redefining it. Stephen tried to pivot. He glanced down at a new card. Let's lighten it up, huh? He said with a forced chuckle. You're from Texas. You guys have, what, the best barbecue, the hottest summers, and the most lawsuits against the federal government. Scattered laughter. Jasmine smiled. But it wasn't from amusement. It was the kind of smile that came before a storm. Texas taught me 2 things, she replied. How to survive heat, and how to recognize when someone's trying to cook you slow and pretend it's hospitality. The room went quiet again. Stephen tried again. Okay. Then let's go personal. What do you do to relax? Music? Books? Do you ever just unplug? Jasmine leaned forward. Stephen, I don't have the luxury of unplugging. My constituents can't turn off the reality of food deserts, eviction notices, and crumbling schools. If I unplug, I'm abandoning them. He blinked. But don't you need to recharge? I recharge when a mother tells me her kid finally got into a school that doesn't smell like mold. I recharge when a 19-year-old emails me that his landlord fixed the heater because my office made one call. She wasn't angry. She was intentional. And before you say it, she added, I know that makes me sound intense. But maybe intensity's overdue. Colbert folded his hands. You're aware how this sounds to the average viewer? You're on a late-night show, and instead of comedy, you're delivering a congressional reckoning. That's because America doesn't need more laughs right now, Jasmine said plainly. It needs someone willing to stare the discomfort in the face. Even when the lights are hot. Even when the host is nervous. A beat. Stephen took a breath. I'm not nervous. Jasmine's gaze didn't budge. Then ask the question you're holding back. He froze. Just for a second. Then slowly, carefully, he said, all right. You ever worry you're burning bridges? She answered without pause. Only the ones that led us into this mess. The crowd didn't cheer. They couldn't. It wasn't a line meant for applause. It was meant to settle deep, like ash after a fire. Stephen sat back. You realize you're probably not getting invited back. Jasmine finally smiled, for real this time. That's okay. I didn't come here to be liked. I came here to be heard. And in that moment, every camera in the studio captured the same thing, not a politician performing, but a woman commanding the room with nothing but truth. By the next morning, clips from the show had exploded across every platform. The title, Stephen went funny, Jasmine went nuclear. But it wasn't comedy fans sharing it. It was teachers, nurses, social workers, and teenagers who'd never watched a late-night show before. The moment wasn't just viral, it was visceral. One clip led the wave, Jasmine's line about unplugging. The comments section was full of people nodding, crying, typing things like, This is why my mom never took a day off. I work 3 jobs. I felt every word. I've never heard someone say it like that on TV. Stephen's team had posted a polished highlight reel. But it wasn't the version taking off. It was the raw, uncut footage. The silences. The stare-downs. The moments where the laugh track didn't play. Meanwhile, political commentators scrambled. Was this bravery? Was it career suicide? Was she grandstanding or finally saying what others were too afraid to? Jasmine didn't respond. She was already back in Dallas, at a town hall where the mic squeaked and the water cups were plastic. A man in a janitor's uniform stood to speak. I saw you last night, he said. Didn't know who you were before that. But my daughter watched it 5 times. Jasmine nodded. Tell her I said thank you. No, he said, voice cracking, you already did. Back in New York, Stephen rewatched the full taping privately. He sat alone in his office. No audience. No applause. Just the silence she'd left behind. He finally turned to his assistant and said, we invite a lot of voices. But she brought a story. Should we bring her back? Stephen shook his head slowly. Not yet. Let her finish what she's building. When she's ready, we won't need to book her. America will. And he meant it. That night had changed the show. Not because of ratings. But because for once, entertainment had taken a back seat, and truth had driven straight through the screen. It wasn't long before the headlines caught up. The moment Jasmine Crockett broke late night. Not just a clapback, a cultural reset. When silence hits louder than applause. Cable news couldn't decide how to frame it. One network called her defiant. Another said powerful. A few settled for controversial, the safe term used when truth threatens comfort. But for everyday people, the kind who'd never cared for DC hearings or Colbert monologues, it wasn't about the labels. It was about recognition. Finally, Someone had said out loud what they lived every day. Even critics had to admit, Jasmine hadn't delivered a performance. She'd dropped a mirror. And that mirror was uncomfortable. In one especially biting op-ed, a columnist wrote, "Crockett walked into a comedy show and delivered a sermon. Not of religion, but of reality. She didn't crack jokes, she cracked the narrative." But the most telling response came not from pundits or papers. It came from a woman in Milwaukee, who posted a grainy video holding her baby in one hand, phone in the other. "I don't know much about Congress," she said. But that woman? She sounded like she lived next door. That clip got 2 million views in 48 hours. Because Jasmine's words weren't about policy points. They were about something deeper, legitimacy. Whose pain is valid? Whose truth is allowed on stage? Meanwhile, in Washington, whispers had already begun. She's too bold. She's not strategic enough. She doesn't play the game. But Jasmine wasn't interested in playing. When asked by a reporter if she'd tone it down in future media appearances, she laughed. "You don't ask fire to be quieter. You ask why the room was cold." That line, too, went viral. Not because it was clever. Because it was her. A week after the interview, Jasmine walked into a closed-door briefing on housing reforms. The usual suspects were there: senators who checked their watches, aides who whispered behind folders, lobbyists who hovered near coffee urns. But this time, the room quieted when she entered. Not out of respect. Out of recognition. They'd all seen it, the clip, the moment, the firestorm. And they didn't know what to do with her now. She wasn't just the congresswoman from Texas anymore. She was the woman who didn't blink on Colbert. The one who shut down a comedy show without raising her voice. The briefing began, full of data and delays. Charts. Slide decks. Buzzwords that meant very little to the people they supposedly served. Until Jasmine raised her hand. "Let me ask something," she said, flipping open her notes. "How many of you have actually walked through a public housing unit in the last 6 months? Not for a photo op. Just walked." Silence. One senator chuckled nervously. "We've all read the reports, Congresswoman." She leaned forward. "You can't smell mold in a PDF." Boom. That was it. No insult. No outrage. Just fact. Just impact. The room shifted again. This time, not in discomfort, but in exposure. They'd all seen the headlines, but now they were face to face with the same voice, and she hadn't softened. Because this wasn't about Colbert anymore. Or Twitter. It was about what came next. And Jasmine had no intention of letting that moment fade into a news cycle. She looked around the room and said quietly, "I don't need another interview. I need a vote. What you do here will speak louder than any segment." Then she put her pen down. And waited. The moment lingered. One senator cleared his throat, tried to steer the meeting back to agenda items. But it was too late, the dynamic had shifted. Jasmine had planted something that couldn't be ignored, the undeniable presence of lived truth. After the meeting, an aide from Oregon caught up with her in the hallway. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, what you said in there, that wasn't lost on us." Jasmine gave a small nod. "Good. Then don't let it get buried either." She kept walking. Outside, reporters had gathered, not for her, not yet, but when they saw her, mics popped up instinctively. Someone asked about the Colbert clip. Another asked if she was planning a Senate run. She didn't stop. Instead, she turned slightly and said, "When working-class mothers stop sleeping in their cars, then we'll talk about the next office. Until then, I've got things to do." It wasn't meant to be a soundbite. But it became one. Back in Dallas, community centers had started playing her Colbert segment on loop, not for entertainment, but for inspiration. Young organizers were quoting her in flyers. Churches and shelters began reaching out, asking for town halls, appearances, even workshops. And then came the calls, from people she didn't expect. A retired general. A factory owner from Ohio. A former teacher in upstate New York. Each said the same thing in different words. I didn't agree with you before. Now I'm listening. Not everyone was cheering, of course. Some conservative pundits mocked her tone, questioned her credentials. One cable host ran a full segment titled, Crockett, the left's new darling or dangerous voice. But they missed the point. She wasn't trying to be darling. She was trying to be heard. And now, she was. 2 weeks after the Colbert appearance, Jasmine was back in her district, standing in a sun-faded gymnasium in South Dallas, surrounded by folding chairs, cheap fans, and people who didn't speak in policy briefs but lived in the wreckage of those policies every day. This was her real stage. No cameras. No cue cards. No laugh track. A woman in her 50s raised her hand. Congresswoman, what do we do when they just won't listen? Jasmine didn't flinch. We make it impossible for them not to. The crowd nodded. Not clapped. Nodded. This was the difference. She wasn't performing. She was building. Meanwhile, in D.C., clips from her interview were still circulating. Not the flashy ones, the quiet ones. The silences. The moments where Stephen Colbert blinked, unsure of how to follow up. The tension in her voice when she said, "We can't keep laughing our way through someone else's collapse." Young interns whispered her name in Capitol hallways. Lobbyists started watching her votes a little closer. And in a newsroom in Manhattan, a senior editor pitched a cover story, "The Woman Who Changed the Room." But Jasmine wasn't reading the coverage. She was helping an elderly woman fill out a housing voucher form. She was taking calls from a local high school about mold in the locker rooms. She was showing up to places that would never make the headlines, because they were the reason she had won. Back on Capitol Hill, someone asked her in passing, "Do you think your Colbert moment will last?" Jasmine turned, a quiet smile playing across her face. If it doesn't change anything, it wasn't a moment. It was just noise. And that was her truth. Not the viral. Not the viral ready. Just truth. Served plain. Unapologetic. And finally, being heard. 3 months after the interview, Jasmine Crockett walked into a bipartisan housing summit in Baltimore. The room buzzed with national press, policy experts, foundation heads, people who used phrases like stakeholder alignment and urban revitalization. She stood alone for a moment, scanning the space. Then she walked to the front. This time, there was no need for introductions. No need to prove herself. Her name had already become a shorthand for something bigger. For clarity. For confrontation. For conscience. She opened her remarks with no preamble. Before we talk solutions, she said, let's stop pretending we're solving the same problem. Because if your solution begins with investor incentives and mine begins with mold removal, we're not in the same room. A few attendees exchanged glances. She wasn't here to make them comfortable. She was here to make them accountable. And they knew it. She told stories, again. Of families in housing limbo. Of communities swallowed by silence. She didn't ask for pity. She asked for policy. And she did it without apology. After her remarks, a younger panelist leaned over and whispered, "You're the only person who made me feel like I wasn't crazy for being angry." Jasmine smiled softly. Anger's not the enemy. Indifference is. That night, back in her hotel, she opened her inbox. Hundreds of new messages. Some thanking her. some asking for help. One from a woman in Iowa, whose town didn't even have a grocery store anymore. "You made me feel seen," the woman wrote. "Like we mattered too." Jasmine didn't cry. But she sat still for a long time. Because that was the point. Not just going viral. Not just making a moment. But stitching voices together across state lines, across race, across silence, until people who were never supposed to find each other realized they were in the same fight all along. And now, someone had finally said it, on late-night TV, in the hearing room, in front of the whole damn country. And she'd say it again if she had to. Because as long as the silence returned, Jasmine would return louder. Stephen went in with a smirk. Jasmine left with the room. What started as a late-night exchange turned into a national conversation. Not just about politics. Not just about housing. But about truth. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge the jokes, she challenged the comfort. The silence. The systems built on distraction. Because sometimes, one calm voice can feel louder than an entire studio audience. And if you felt seen tonight, if even one line reminded you of your neighborhood, your family, your fight, then remember, your story matters. Share this. Speak this. Stand with this. Because the world doesn't change with applause. It changes when someone finally says, "I'm done laughing. It's time to listen." Clapperboard, this was more than an interview. This was Jasmine Crockett. Don't forget to subscribe. Your voice counts too.